Good morning or afternoon. Welcome to another of the HRO Today educational webinars series presentations. We have a great presentation today, and one that I think is very pressing for all HR executives and leaders concerning the relationship between recruitment and engagement. And we all talk about talent management now being potentially one thing, but yet we still don't always think about the connection between the two. I think everyone agrees axiomatically that how someone feels on their first day of work will influence how they engage with that company and for how long. What is that relationship between engagement on day one and engagement for the future? We're going to talk about that. We have two fabulous speakers joining us today. This is hosted by Orion Novotus. We have their president, who is a thought leader. Cory Kruse has been with Orion Novotus as president for a number of years of his 20-plus year career. Orion Novotus specializes in recruitment process outsourcing solutions. This ranked #1 overall and #1 in quality on our HRO Today 2017 Baker's Dozen list for RPO leaders for mid-sized deals. And when we talk about mid-sized deals, these are deals that are for companies that are in a market environment of between about 2,000 and 10,000 employees, but they can be for much larger companies at division level or depending on the company's needs. So Cory's worked with a variety of different types of industries: energy, technology, defense, construction, retail, and hospitality. And he's also an expert in workforce planning and sourcing strategies. Orion Novotus is a leader in technology, metrics, and analytics. We are also joined by Katy Theroux. Katy is the CHRO of the NCI Group. It's a publicly traded firm that designs and manufactures metal buildings for the non-residential construction industry. She is a groundbreaking cross-functional strategist, and I'll explain that in saying this. Katy has the unusual responsibilities of both being the head of HR and the head of marketing. And we'll talk later about how that may solve a lot of employee branding issues. She's worked with technology, service, and manufacturing companies for more than 20 years. And she manages very complex enterprise-wide initiatives for NCI. And a lot of her responsibility is about transforming both the customer and the candidate experience. So welcome, Cory and Katy. Cory, why don't you get us started? So is there, how do you guys see this connection, and what can you do when you are recruiting, to help drive engagement of the candidate through the great candidate experience and then into their tenure as an employee?
Thank you, Elliot, for the introduction and what you and the team at HRO Today does for the industry in whole. Appreciate the opportunity to talk. This is very important for us as an RPO provider, even more important for Katy and her team at NCI as they are driving to move the needle forward and to retain to attract and retain the best employees out there. Why is this topic relevant to the business right now? Well, the competition for labor is high. The supply and demand is not equal. We have a very limited labor supply in a very high demand world. Things like cost disruptions to the business, inefficiencies created by having non-engaged employees or high turnover are things that limit a business's ability to drive business outcomes. Just the cost alone involved in replacing an employee are tremendous. So for us, a collaborative nature of our relationship with NCI is really driving to focus on engagement with the candidates, and we're going to talk more about how we really define engagement, where it stops and where it starts, and we're going to get into some details on that.
So Katy, as a partner with Orion Novotus, you really have this issue of the candidate and the employee, through HR. You also have marketing. So, we don't see that very often. Head of HR, head of marketing, and invested in the same executive. What synergies are you finding in that role?
Thanks, Elliot, and thanks for having me today. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. That's a great question, Elliot. I think for me, my background and career really started in human resources, but I always had a heavy business operational focus in the companies that I worked in, the roles that I had. And over time, about 10 years ago, I was asked to take on the marketing function at a mid-sized company. And at the time, I thought it was just, okay, let me take this on and see what I can do to add value to that part of the organization. But what my boss had said to me was, and very insightfully, was this idea that the customer experience, the employee experience, the brand really overlap. And when you think about what your brand means to your customers, it's really the point at which your employees and your customers interact. And so in that sense, there's a lot of synergies with human resources and marketing. And we could probably spend 3 days, drawing those things out on the board. But as it relates to this conversation, I think the brand of the company, the customer experience, and the employee experience have to be aligned. Yes, the attributes and what people are looking for may be different, but those lines are becoming fuzzier and fuzzier. And so as we think about communicating, we think about not only what's the right message to get to the customer to sell more buildings or to add more value, but we also think about how is that message going to impact our employees and how is that going to help us attract and retain talent in the marketplace. Cory's opening comments, you could have replaced some of the words about recruiting with customer or employee with customer, and those are exactly the conversations we're having in the business every day. So these experiences are really, from a customer point of view and an employee point of view, continue to come together.
Well, it's interesting when you think about HR and marketing, and one of the things that I think is different from some of the more analytical, areas of business, such as accounting and finance, is they always start with answers, where in HR and marketing, you always start with questions. All right, and not that there's anything wrong with the approach of starting with the data and beginning to derive the questions. We start with the questions, then go out to sort of understand them. Cory, what are the questions that drive this issue? How does one begin to break it down into sort of mind-sized chunks?
All right, Elliot, I'm glad you asked that. We're going to go into today's questions here. So recruiting for retention, what is that? How do we recruit to ensure that those folks that we recruit are going to stay long enough to accomplish what the business needs to be accomplished? And for all terms and purposes, have a career. How are we going to build as providers and as HR leaders and business leaders, career-stomers, as they call it? How can better employee engagement be driven through better recruitment? How does recruitment ultimately play a part in whether or not somebody contributes heavily and stays for a long time? And then we're going to talk about what are the candidate engagement best practices for both frontline and operational leaders. What are those things that we need to do on the front end from when somebody learns about an opportunity with NCI all the way through their tenure at NCI? How do we engage them up front, compel them enough to come aboard, and then keep them engaged and productive and relatively happy along the way. So here's the bad news. People actually start looking for their next position sooner than we think. We need to be doing everything we can before the candidate starts the job to make sure that they're engaged and to make sure that we drive these statistics down. 23% of candidates out there are talent that is placed start looking for a job on their first day at work, or they could be experiencing some residual communication with folks that were interested in them prior. 40% within the first 30 days. These are huge numbers. These are numbers that that we can do something about. These are numbers that have a solution attached to them. Examining your recruiting and onboarding processes closely to make sure that we're not undermining the productivity and retention. This is really the essence of recruiting for retention. I'm going to ask Katy, do you believe these numbers are realistic? Do you think that there's people that we've recruited into the organization that are looking for a job on their first day or within their first months?
Cory, I was actually shocked when I saw these numbers, and then when you shared them with me a few weeks ago, and then when I sat back and I really thought about it, it makes a lot of sense. To your point, the competition in the marketplace today is so strong for talent that many times we're seeing candidates with multiple offers, or to your point, things in process. So we have to make sure from the time the employee enters our building that they feel like they want to be here and that we want them to be here. And so if you sort of turn this a little bit and think about it more from a customer acquisition perspective, if you're thinking about the customer, it's all about what have you done for me today? Okay, great. Here's the service that you need. Okay, I'm back. I need the next thing. So the relationships are important, but you have to think every day that I have to continue to delight the customer, and I have to continue to exceed the customer's expectations. We have to think about that in the same way from a talent point of view. The one thing that I think makes a big difference for people, and something that's been anecdotally shared with me and our HR leadership team, is having an onboarding plan for the employee. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about the whole recruitment process, engaging people from pre to post. But once we bring people on board, back to this idea of the first day, we want to make sure they have a plan. Even if it's an Excel spreadsheet with a list of 10 people they have to meet, those appointments have already been set up for them, a checklist of things they need to get done in their first couple of weeks on the job. We've had employees tell us that this has made all the difference, that they've worked for really big companies and haven't had that kind of experience. And it just makes them feel like they're wanted and they want to be a part of this place. And that's the kind of culture that we're trying to create. So while I was surprised at first, the more I process on this, the more it makes sense to me.
Thank you, Katy. Yeah, when you think about it, 15, 20 years ago, in a relationship between a recruiting provider and a customer, there was multiple conversations around, it's not our responsibility, we recruited them. It's your responsibility now, Katy. That's changed. It's all our responsibility. The good news is there's something that can be done about it. Teams with high employee engagement rates are 21% more productive, according to Gallup, and there's some other surveys out there. Employees who are engaged are 27% more likely to report excellent performance. And then companies with engaged employees outperform those without by 202%. This is huge. Research absolutely shows that engagement pays off. Gallup, Aon Hewitt, Watson Wyatt have all documented measurable improvements in performance and productivity. I'm going to ask Elliot, The connection between engagement and productivity is one that HRO today has long been interested in. You guys have invested time, thought leadership. Why is that? What additional connections do you see, Elliot, between engagement and ultimately employee productivity and you know, at the end, proven business results?
That's a great question. Before I get to that, I'm just going to remind the audience that we are listening to a presentation. We're being hosted today by Orion Novotus. This is an HRO Today educational session on the connection between recruiting and engagement and how it can help drive productivity. If you have a question on your webinar interface, you'll see a box where you can type questions in. We will get to them later in this webcast. So please feel free to ask a question if you have one, and we will do everything we can to address all of your questions by the end of the presentation. So, you know, Cory, it's interesting, and I probably am thinking more about this because I was in Dublin last week for the HRO Today Forum EMEA. And, you know, one of the sort of insights I had in life was with my son, had to read the book Ulysses for school. So I reread it with him about 15 years ago. At the time, I was an executive with Connexa. This was pre-IBM Connexa, you know, but I was with Connexa, and we were doing engagement surveys and other products. And, you know, basically, I remember sitting there thinking to myself, you know, employees live their lives in a stream of consciousness, okay? That may be more or less confusing than James Joyce's writings. But the reality is that what happens to you today doesn't change just because you move to a different tower in the HR Ulrich model or whatever. It's not like, well, I'm done recruiting, so now I have a clean emotional and intellectual clean slate to begin day one, and then after 30 days, I'm done onboarding. Everything sort of accumulates in this stream of consciousness and how people react. So we looked at engagement, you know, as one of the really important ways to measure HR and impact and also manager behavior. Right? We all know that the relationship between first-line supervisor and an employee or associate is very, very important. So how do you manage that behavior? And that's HR's responsibility to help manage culture, et cetera. So if you know, whether it was Connexa or Gallup or DDI or Mercer or whatever, everyone was looking at this connection. And one of the things that I think is a gap, and certainly HRO Today has been talking about engagement, talking about culture, talking about, you know, things like corporate responsibility and its impact on engagement, et cetera, you know, recognition, all these other facets that make up, you know, this sort of nebulous word culture. But one of the things that we've been looking at is how does HR measure its impact? And this is a big one. That's part of it. And also, you know, what's the interaction? Most times we think about engagement, as being an experience, you know, an emotional attachment to the mission of the company, but we tend to survey employees and take them seriously if they've been with a company more than X number of months, 6 months, 12 months, depends on the report that you look at, you know, and how that particular survey responder handles it. Reality is, it's day one. If 23% of the people arrive looking for a job, you better get them on board with your mission very quickly.